Richard Michelson is well known here in Western Massachusetts and beyond as the man behind our Michelson Gallery in Northampton, but he's also the author of multiple picture books aimed at young readers. His latest work is fascinating, The Life of Leonard Nimoy, the actor, director, author, and artist, best known as Mr. Spock of the Star Trek TV and movie series. But to Richard Michelson, Nimoy was a close friend since they'd met at an event in Amherst years ago.
I was fortunate. We met at the Yiddish Book Center, as you mentioned. I have an earlier picture book called Too Young for Yiddish that he recorded for the Yiddish Book Center. And we just hit it off right away. We talked about art, we talked about literature. I was familiar with his photography and eventually got to represent him at my gallery. But more than that, we became personal friends. And as I mentioned in my book, we did speak every day for the last 12 years of his life. A wonderful man, and I do miss him.
As you got to know him, as you worked with him, when did the light bulb kind of click that said, this man's story is a book?
Well, it's interesting because Leonard and I traveled together regularly for a dozen years. Easiest book I ever had to research. Over dinner with him telling stories. And we often talked about our backgrounds. We come from somewhat similar working class backgrounds, although I was a generation later in Brooklyn, New York. He was in Boston. We both grew into families where our fathers had shops down the street. We would bring them the paper. In his case, it was a barber shop his dad had. In my case, my dad had a hardware store. And I'd written many children's books about both well-known and lesser well-known people, but it never really occurred to me to write his story, and I don't know why, because when I talk at conferences, I'm always telling children and adults, you're surrounded by stories. Listen, write it down. And of course, I facilitated many interviews for Leonard over the years with people wanting to know his story, which is fascinating. And it really wasn't until the end of his life. I did not know at the time it was the end of his life. I'm glad I sat down. I wrote this story. I didn't tell Leonard that I was writing it because, if it didn't work out the way I had hoped, I didn't want him to be asking, where's that book? But it was Thanksgiving morning in 2014. I finally finished it. I read it over. I knew I had something I was proud of. I knew I had something that worked, that I'd be able to sell. And I sent him the manuscript. As was his wont, he emailed me back within 5 minutes, and then again later saying, I love it, I'm so honored you decided to do this. And then later that evening, he sent me a few kind of corrections. I had forgotten the name of the temple where he first saw what became world famous as the Vulcan hand gesture, and we can talk about that next. I'd forgotten the name of his second grade best friend, all these things, because this is a story about his growing up as a child of immigrants in the West End of Boston. And it's especially pertinent today. It's about following your dreams, about not giving up, but also it's about remembering where you came from. And Leonard was very close to his family. He brought much of his background into the character Spock. If you see that I'm wearing a T-shirt here instead of a suit this time, on the back of my T-shirt is a young Leonard making that gesture that he first saw in temple as an 8-year-old boy. His father, during a Hebraic prayer, his father told him to turn away, don't look. But he was 8 years old and he peeked. And what he saw were the elders of the temple raising their hands in what became known as the world famous as the Vulcan hand signal. And the book starts there. It ends with the second season of Star Trek when we first visit the planet Vulcan. And the script called for Leonard to meet the Vulcan queen and shake her hand. And he said, Vulcans shouldn't just shake hands. They should do something different. Military men salute, Asians bow. And the director said, okay, well, what do Vulcans do? But he hadn't thought ahead. So he was on the spot. And he remembered this time in as a boy in Temple. It was a gesture that had fascinated him, that he practiced throughout his life. He raised his hands in the gesture which is the first letter of the word Shaddai, which is a name for God, or Shalom, peace. It's the Hebrew letter Shin. And that became a cultural hot point. He said he knew right away. As soon as the show aired, he walked out on the street and people would walk up to him saying, "Live long and prosper." And he loved the fact that even if they didn't know it, what people were really doing were blessing each other, because it's a blessing.
How did this brilliant, cultured, erudite man deal with being best known for wearing a sort of beetle haircut and pointy prosthetic ears as the emotionless, half-human, half-Vulcan Spock?
You know, I think there's kind of a rumor that he resented being typecast, especially because his first biography was called I Am Not Spock. He followed it, of course, later with another biography called I Am Spock. He loved the character. And Leonard always said that if he had to choose one character throughout his career to be identified with, that is the character he would have chosen. And a lot is because he did bring so much of himself to the role. His parents escaped from Zaslav, Ukraine during a pogrom. His mother was smuggled out in a hay cart. His dad snuck across the border. And Leonard grew up very much with a feeling of being an outsider. In fact, we have his parents' papers when they came through the Statue of Liberty, and they were stamped alien. And when Leonard was offered the job as Spock, what he said to Mr. Roddenberry was, "My parents came here as aliens. They worked very hard to be citizens. I grew up as a citizen, and it's time for me now to complete the circle and become an alien."
If you are a Star Trek fan, you've got to add it to your collection, no question about it.
Thank you very much.
Richard Michelson, thank you so much for coming in and for the book.
Thank you for having me here. Absolute pleasure.